The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Atlanta Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. It was 9:15 a.m. on a busy Monday, and Courtroom 3 was already packed with people waiting for their cases to be heard. Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his black robe and settled into his leather chair, scanning the crowded room with practiced indifference. At 45 years old, he had earned a reputation as one of the city's most difficult judges, known for his sharp tongue and impatient demeanor. His perfectly styled gray hair and expensive watch spoke of a man who took pride in his position and authority. "Next case," he called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom's speaker system. The court clerk shuffled some papers and announced, "Case number 2347, Richardson versus Atlanta Development Corporation." The gentle tapping of a wooden cane against the floor drew everyone's attention. An elderly black man slowly made his way toward the front of the courtroom. He wore a clean but well-worn brown suit that had clearly seen better days, and his wire-rimmed glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose. Despite his modest appearance, there was something dignified about the way he carried himself. Several younger lawyers in expensive suits stepped aside, some barely hiding their impatience as the old man carefully navigated the narrow aisle. His movements were deliberate, each step measured and careful, supported by his worn wooden cane that made a soft thud against the floor with every step. Judge Bennett drummed his fingers on the bench, making no attempt to hide his irritation at the slow pace. A few court officers exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this judge's behavior before when dealing with elderly defendants who took too much of his precious time. The old man finally reached the podium. He was tall despite his slight stoop, probably close to 6 feet in his younger days. His face showed the lines of age and experience, but his eyes were clear and alert behind those old-fashioned glasses. "State your name for the record," Judge Bennett said, not bothering to look up from his papers. "Dr. James Richardson," the elderly man replied, his voice soft but steady. The acoustics in the courtroom made it difficult to hear him clearly. Judge Bennett looked up sharply. "Speak up, please." "We don't have all day," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Dr. Richardson cleared his throat and spoke again, slightly louder this time. "My name is Dr. James Richardson, Your Honor. I'm here regarding the property dispute with Atlanta Development Corporation." "And what exactly is your doctorate in, Mr. Richardson?" Judge Bennett asked with a smirk, emphasizing the Mr. while ignoring the doctor title. A few snickers could be heard from the back of the courtroom. Before Dr. Richardson could answer, Judge Bennett waved his hand dismissively. "Never mind that. Just tell us why you're wasting the court's time today." Dr. Richardson remained composed, though someone observant might have noticed his grip tightening slightly on his cane. He began explaining his case, speaking in the same measured, dignified tone. "Your Honor, I've owned the property at 1253 Auburn Avenue for the past 50 years. It's been a community center serving underprivileged youth since 1968. The Atlanta Development Corporation is attempting to seize it through eminent domain to build luxury apartments." Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, making a show of checking his watch. The morning sun caught the expensive timepiece, sending little sparkles of light across the podium where Dr. Richardson stood. "And do you have any actual legal basis for contesting this, or are you just here to tell us stories about the good old days?" Judge Bennett asked, drawing more chuckles from some of the court officers and younger lawyers in the room. Dr. Richardson opened his worn leather briefcase, his weathered hands moving slowly but surely as he retrieved some documents. The judge's impatient sighs and eye-rolling continued, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in the courtroom. What nobody noticed was a young female lawyer in the back of the courtroom, her eyes growing wider with each passing moment. She had been frantically typing on her phone since Dr. Richardson had stated his name, and now she was staring at her screen in disbelief. Her hand slowly rose into the air, trembling slightly. The stage was set for a moment that would change Judge Bennett's life forever, though he didn't know it yet. His next few minutes of continued disrespect toward the elderly man before him would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. The young lawyer in the back of the courtroom, Sarah Martinez, could hardly contain herself as she watched the scene unfold. Her hand remained raised, but Judge Bennett was too busy mocking Dr. Richardson to notice. "So, Mr. Richardson," Judge Bennett continued, deliberately ignoring the doctor title again, "you're telling me this rundown community center of yours is more important than new development in our city?" He leaned forward, his gold cufflinks catching the morning light. Dr. Richardson carefully laid out his documents on the podium. His hands, though wrinkled with age, didn't shake as he arranged the papers. Your Honor, if you'll allow me to present the evidence, you'll see that the property has historical significance. It was one of the first. Historical significance? Judge Bennett interrupted with a laugh that echoed through the courtroom. Let me guess, somebody famous once walked past it. Several young lawyers chuckled, following the judge's lead. The elderly man stood straighter, his dignity intact despite the mockery. Actually, Your Honor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't just walk past it. He helped establish. Oh, here we go. Judge Bennett rolled his eyes dramatically. Another story about Dr. King. Do you know how many cases I get where people try to block progress by dropping his name? He looked around the courtroom, seeking approval from his audience. Sarah Martinez could no longer stay quiet. Your Honor, she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. I must interrupt. Counsel, unless you're representing Mr. Richardson, please remain seated. Judge Bennett snapped, not even bothering to look in her direction. Dr. Richardson remained calm, though his eyes showed a flash of something, not anger, but perhaps disappointment. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a faded photograph. Your Honor, if I may. Mr. Richardson. Judge Bennett cut him off again. This court's time is valuable. We have 20 more cases to hear today. Unless you have actual legal documents to present. Those documents are right in front of you, Your Honor. Dr. Richardson said quietly, pointing to the papers he had placed on the bench, including the original deed signed in 1968, the historical property designation from 1975, and... Judge Bennett picked up the papers carelessly, barely glancing at them. Well, these look like they were typed up on a typewriter from the Stone Age, he quipped, drawing more laughter from his supporters in the room. They were actually typed on an IBM Selectric Alloy in my office at Morehouse College, Dr. Richardson replied calmly. The same office where I served as department chair for 30 years. Something in his tone made Judge Bennett pause for a split second, but he quickly recovered his mocking demeanor. Department chair? Of what? The Community Center Preservation Society. He smiled at his own joke. Sarah Martinez was now standing, her law firm's designer suit making her look every bit as professional as the judge. Your Honor, I really must insist. Young lady, one more outburst and you'll be in contempt. Judge Bennett threatened, finally turning to look at her. The morning sun had fully filled the courtroom now, and in its bright light, something curious was happening. The atmosphere was shifting. The court officers who had been smirking earlier were starting to look uncomfortable. A few of the older lawyers in the room were whispering to each other, their faces showing growing concern. Dr. Richardson reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. The gold lettering on its cover caught the sunlight, making the words Congressional Medal of Honor clearly visible to everyone in the front row. Judge Bennett was too busy making another snide remark to notice. I suppose next you'll tell me you're some kind of war hero too, he said sarcastically. The elderly man placed the medal citation carefully on the bench. Vietnam, 1968, he said simply. Just before I came back to help desegregate Atlanta's schools. The judge's smirk froze on his face as his eyes finally fell on the medal citation. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah Martinez's voice rang out clear and strong. Your Honor, if I may speak now, I believe there's something about Dr. Richardson that you really need to know. The stage was set for a revelation that would wipe the smile off Judge Bennett's face permanently. Sarah Martinez strode confidently to the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. The young lawyer clutched her phone in one hand, her evidence ready to present. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear. The man standing before you is Dr. James Richardson, PhD in Education from Harvard University, PhD in Civil Rights Law from Yale, and PhD in Social Psychology from Stanford. Judge Bennett's smirk began to fade as Sarah continued. He was the youngest professor ever tenured at Morehouse College, where he taught for over 40 years and served as department chair of both education and African American studies. Dr. Richardson stood quietly at the podium, his hands folded calmly over his cane. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to form a halo around his silver hair. But that's just his academic career, Sarah pressed on. In 1965, Dr. Richardson walked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. He didn't just name-drop Dr. King earlier, they were close friends and collaborated on numerous civil rights initiatives. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Judge Bennett's face had lost its arrogant expression, replaced by a growing look of horror. "The community center you just mocked, Your Honor." Sarah's voice took on an edge. It was established by Dr. Richardson and Dr. King together. It was one of the first integrated youth centers in the South. Over the past 50 years, it has helped more than 100,000 underprivileged children get into college. She held up her phone, displaying a photograph. This is Dr. Richardson receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1996. And yes, that Congressional Medal of Honor he just showed you. He'd earned it by saving his entire platoon in Vietnam, despite being wounded himself. Judge Bennett's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Several of the older lawyers in the courtroom were now nodding in recognition, whispering among themselves about articles they'd read and speeches they'd heard. Dr. Richardson currently serves as chairman of the Atlanta Education Board, the Civil Rights Memorial Foundation, and the Southern Poverty Law Initiative, Sarah continued. He's advised 3 presidents on education reform and civil rights legislation. The building next to this courthouse, the Richardson Center for Legal Justice. Yes, it's named after him. The judge was now gripping his desk so hard his knuckles had turned white. The court officers who had been laughing earlier were staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "And one more thing, Your Honor," Sarah added, her voice taking on a quiet intensity. "That property dispute you're hearing today, the Atlanta Development Corporation is trying to seize a building that's already been designated as a National Historic Landmark. The community center provides free after-school programs, meals for homeless children, and college preparation courses for first-generation students." Dr. Richardson finally spoke, his soft voice carrying clearly in the silent courtroom. "I didn't want to mention these things myself, Your Honor. I've always believed a person's actions should speak louder than their titles or achievements." Judge Bennett opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in his career, he appeared completely at a loss for words. "The center also houses a legal aid clinic," Dr. Richardson continued gently, "where we provide free legal services to those who can't afford representation. In fact, Your Honor, your own father was one of our volunteer lawyers there in the 1980s. The judge's face went from red to pale as the memory hit him. He had been a teenager when his father, a respected civil rights attorney, had spent evenings and weekends working at a community center, the same center he had just mocked. Sarah Martinez stepped back, her point made. The younger lawyers who had been laughing earlier were now frantically Googling Dr. Richardson's name on their phones, their expressions growing increasingly mortified as they read about his legendary career and contributions. The courtroom waited in tense silence for Judge Bennett's response. The man who had been so quick to judge, so eager to mock, now faced a moment of reckoning. His next words would either redeem him or cement his shame in front of a man who had helped shape American history. Dr. Richardson simply stood there, patient and dignified, waiting for justice to take its course. Judge Bennett sat frozen in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible shame. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as memories of his father's stories about working at the community center came flooding back. "Dr. Richardson," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea." "Few people do, Your Honor," Dr. Richardson replied kindly. "I'd never believed in wearing my achievements like badges. The work itself has always been more important than recognition." The elderly man opened his worn briefcase once more and retrieved a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This might interest you, Your Honor. It's from 1984. He carefully placed it on the bench. Judge Bennett picked up the clipping with trembling hands. There, in faded black and white, was a photograph of his father standing next to a younger Dr. Richardson, both men smiling as they helped a group of children with their homework. "Your father, James Bennett Sr., was one of our most dedicated volunteers," Dr. Richardson continued. "He used to bring his teenage son with him sometimes, a bright young man who dreamed of becoming a judge one day." The color drained from Judge Bennett's face as the memory hit him. He had been that teenager, sitting in the corner of the community center, watching his father work. He had even met Dr. Richardson back then, though the man's hair had been black instead of silver. Sarah Martinez stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may present some additional context about the property dispute. Judge Bennett nodded numbly, unable to speak. The Atlanta Development Corporation's proposal would not only destroy a historic landmark, but would eliminate services that currently benefit over 500 children annually, Sarah explained. The center provides free meals to 200 homeless children every day, tutoring services that have helped 1,000 students become first-generation college graduates, and legal aid that serves over 3,000 low-income families each year. Dr. Richardson pulled out more photographs from his briefcase. They showed children of all races studying together, elderly volunteers serving meals, and lawyers providing free consultations. The images spanned decades, telling a story of community service and dedication. Some of those children went on to become doctors, lawyers, and yes, even judges. Dr. Richardson said softly, "We believe every person deserves a chance to achieve their dreams, regardless of their background or appearance." The subtle reminder of Judge Bennett's prejudiced behavior made him flinch. Around the courtroom, people were beginning to whisper about other achievements they knew about Dr. Richardson. Didn't he help establish the city's first integrated hospital? I heard he founded a scholarship program for minority students. My grandmother says he personally paid college tuition for dozens of poor kids. Judge Bennett looked at the man he had so casually dismissed. Dr. Richardson stood tall despite his age, his dignity intact despite the mockery he had endured. The wooden cane that had drawn snickers earlier now seemed like a mark of distinction, earned through years of standing up for justice. Your father once told me, Dr. Richardson continued, his voice gentle but firm, that his greatest hope was that his son would become a judge who saw the person behind every case, who understood that true justice requires both wisdom and compassion. Those words hit Judge Bennett like a physical blow. He remembered his father saying something similar to him years ago, on the day he was sworn in as a judge. Somehow, in his rise to power, he had forgotten that crucial lesson. The courtroom remained silent, watching this powerful moment of reckoning unfold. The morning sun had risen higher now, its warm light filling the room with an almost ethereal glow. It illuminated Dr. Richardson's face, highlighting the wisdom in his eyes and the gentle smile that showed no trace of bitterness despite the treatment he had received. Judge Bennett looked down at his expensive watch and custom cufflinks, symbols of the status that had made him so arrogant. Then he looked at Dr. Richardson's worn but dignified suit, the well-used briefcase, the simple wooden cane, all testaments to a life spent in service to others rather than in pursuit of personal glory. The moment had come for Judge Bennett to make a choice: continue down his path of prejudice and arrogance, or remember the ideals of justice and equality that had inspired him to become a judge in the first place. Judge Bennett slowly rose from his chair, an action that surprised everyone in the courtroom. It was a breach of usual protocol, but this was no usual moment. His hands were trembling slightly as he removed his reading glasses. Dr. Richardson, he began, his voice thick with emotion, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you an explanation, though I'm not sure I can explain my behavior even to myself. The elderly man raised his hand gently. Your Honor, perhaps we should focus on the matter at hand. The children at the center are waiting for their afternoon programs to begin. This simple statement, prioritizing the needs of others over his own vindication, made Judge Bennett's shame even deeper. Here was a man he had ridiculed, choosing to focus on helping children rather than dwelling on the disrespect he had faced. No, Dr. Richardson, Judge Bennett insisted. The court needs to hear this. He turned to address the packed courtroom. What you have witnessed today is everything a judge should not be. I let prejudice and arrogance cloud my judgment. I forgot the most basic principle of justice, to treat every person with dignity and respect. Sarah Martinez watched from her position near the podium, her legal pad forgotten in her hands. The younger lawyers who had laughed earlier were now scribbling furiously, recording every word of this unprecedented moment. But worse than that, Judge Bennett continued, his voice growing stronger, I forgot my own history. Dr. Richardson, 38 years ago, I sat in your community center. I watched my father work alongside you. I saw firsthand the difference you made in people's lives. Dr. Richardson leaned slightly on his cane, listening quietly. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, creating what looked like a crown of light. I became so focused on power and position that I forgot why I wanted to be a judge in the first place, Bennett admitted. I wanted to make a difference, just like my father did, just like you have been doing for over half a century. A court officer quietly handed Judge Bennett the photograph of his father with Dr. Richardson. He held it up for the courtroom to see. This man, he said, pointing to Dr. Richardson in the photograph, was already a legend when this picture was taken. 3 PhDs, a Congressional Medal of Honor, a friend and colleague of Dr. King, and yet he spent his evenings helping children with their homework. Dr. Richardson shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention but allowing the judge to continue. And today, despite his achievements, despite his age, despite everything he has done for this city and this country, he came to court prepared to argue his case like any other citizen. He brought evidence, documents, and reasoned arguments. He endured my disgraceful behavior with dignity and grace. Judge Bennett stepped down from the bench, another unprecedented action that caused murmurs throughout the courtroom. He walked around to where Dr. Richardson stood. Dr. Richardson, I don't just owe you an apology. I owe an apology to every person who has stood before me in this courtroom. I owe an apology to the memory of my father, who taught me better than this. And I owe an apology to the very principles of justice that I swore to uphold. The elderly man looked at him with understanding in his eyes. Your Honor, he said softly, the measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, it's in how they rectify them. These words, spoken with such simple wisdom, seemed to fill the courtroom. Several people, including Sarah Martinez, were wiping tears from their eyes. Even the most hardened court officers looked moved. Judge Bennett squared his shoulders, making a silent decision. His next words would determine not just the fate of the community center, but perhaps his own legacy as a judge. The morning had begun with laughter at an elderly man's expense. It would end with a lesson in dignity, respect, and the true meaning of justice. Dr. Richardson waited patiently, his weathered hands resting on his cane, a living testament to the power of grace under pressure and the importance of looking beyond appearances to see the true worth of a person. Judge Bennett returned to his bench, but remained standing. The courtroom was completely silent, waiting for his next words. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the tense scene. In light of the evidence presented, and more importantly, in light of my own grievous errors in conduct today, I am recusing myself from this case, he announced firmly. Several gasps echoed through the courtroom. However, he continued, raising his hand for silence, before I do so, I want to place several observations on the record. He picked up the documents Dr. Richardson had presented earlier, handling them now with the respect they deserved. First, these papers clearly establish the historical significance of the community center. Second, the property's designation as a National Historic Landmark should have prevented this case from ever reaching this courtroom. And third, he paused, looking directly at the attorneys for the Atlanta Development Corporation. I am referring this matter to the State Ethics Board for investigation into possible misconduct in filing this suit. The corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their expensive suits. One of them stood up to object, but Judge Bennett cut him off. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing stronger, I am personally initiating a review of every case I presided over in the past 5 years. He turned to his clerk. Ms. Johnson, please schedule a meeting with the Chief Judge for tomorrow morning. My behavior today has made it clear that I need to examine my entire approach to justice. Dr. Richardson watched quietly, his expression thoughtful. Sarah Martinez had moved to stand beside him, ready to provide support if needed, but the elderly man stood straight and strong despite his cane. Dr. Richardson, Judge Bennett addressed him directly, your community center isn't just a building. It's a living piece of history, a testament to what can be achieved when people work together for the greater good. It's also, I'm ashamed to say, a reminder of lessons I learned there as a young man, lessons I seem to have forgotten. He gestured to the photograph of his father and Dr. Richardson. This picture was taken the year I decided to become a judge. I watched my father work pro bono cases at your center, saw how he treated every client with respect regardless of their circumstances. That was the kind of judge I wanted to be. The judge's voice cracked slightly. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that goal. I became exactly the kind of judge I once despised. Arrogant, prejudiced, and quick to judge based on appearances. Dr. Richardson finally spoke, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Your Honor, we all lose our way sometimes. The important thing is finding our way back." These simple words seemed to have a profound effect on Judge Bennett. He straightened his shoulders, as if physically taking on their wisdom. "Before I recuse myself," he said, "I want to make one final statement for the record." He looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with the young lawyers who had laughed along with his earlier mockery. "What we witnessed today was not just about a property dispute. We witnessed dignity in the face of disrespect, wisdom in the face of ignorance, and grace in the face of prejudice. Dr. Richardson has taught us all a valuable lesson about character and justice." The corporate lawyers were now gathering their papers, clearly sensing their case was lost. Several older attorneys in the room were nodding in approval at the judge's words. "This case will be reassigned to another judge," Bennett concluded, "but before we adjourn, I want to extend not just my apologies, but my gratitude to Dr. Richardson. You've reminded me of what true justice looks like." He picked up his gavel, but before he could bring it down, Dr. Richardson spoke again. "Your Honor, might I make one small request?" Judge Bennett immediately lowered the gavel. "Of course, Dr. Richardson. Anything." The elderly man smiled gently. "When you meet with the Chief Judge tomorrow, consider discussing not just what went wrong in your courtroom, but how to make things right for future generations. Perhaps this could be the beginning of something positive." The judge looked at Dr. Richardson with newfound respect, understanding that even now, in this moment of his own public shame, this remarkable man was thinking about how to turn the situation into an opportunity for positive change. The next morning, Judge Bennett arrived at his chambers 2 hours earlier than usual. He had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing old cases and reflecting on his behavior. The events of the previous day had shaken him to his core. On his desk sat the morning's edition of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The headline read, "Historic Moment in Atlanta Courthouse. Judge's Public Reckoning Leads to Judicial Reform Discussions." Below it was a photograph of Dr. Richardson standing dignified beside his cane, taken just outside the courthouse. Judge Bennett's meeting with Chief Judge Margaret Williams was scheduled for 8:00 a.m. As he waited in her office's antechamber, he noticed something unexpected. Dr. Richardson was already there, engaged in quiet conversation with the Chief Judge. "Ah, Michael," Chief Judge Williams called out, "please join us. Dr. Richardson has been sharing some interesting proposals." Bennett entered the office, noticing how Dr. Richardson stood to greet him despite his age and the effort it took. The morning sun illuminated the office through large windows, creating an atmosphere of openness and transparency. "Your Honor," Dr. Richardson said warmly, as if yesterday's incident had never happened, "I was just discussing the possibility of establishing a judicial training program focused on community engagement and cultural sensitivity." Chief Judge Williams nodded enthusiastically. "Dr. Richardson has offered to help develop the curriculum. He suggests incorporating regular visits to community centers, legal aid clinics, and other grassroots organizations to help judges better understand the communities they serve." Judge Bennett sat down, amazed at how this man had transformed a moment of public humiliation into an opportunity for systemic improvement. Furthermore, Dr. Richardson continued, "Several of our center's success stories, doctors, lawyers, and business leaders who started as disadvantaged youth, have volunteered to participate in the training sessions. They'll share their perspectives on how the justice system affected their lives." Chief Judge Williams turned to Bennett. "Michael, given your recent experience, I believe you're uniquely positioned to help implement this program. Would you be willing to work with Dr. Richardson on this?" Bennett looked at the elderly man who had shown him such grace in the face of disrespect. "It would be an honor," he said quietly, "though I'm not sure I deserve the opportunity." Dr. Richardson smiled gently. "Judge Bennett, sometimes our most powerful teaching tools are our own mistakes. Your public acknowledgement yesterday took courage. That's exactly the kind of honesty this program needs." The Chief Judge opened a folder on her desk. "I've reviewed the transcript from yesterday's proceedings. While your initial behavior was concerning, your subsequent actions showed remarkable integrity. Not many judges would have admitted their mistakes so publicly." "Dr. Richardson helped me remember why I became a judge in the first place," Bennett admitted. "Yesterday, when he showed me that photograph of him working with my father." About that photograph, Dr. Richardson interrupted, reaching into his briefcase. I brought something else you might want to see. He carefully pulled out another old photograph. This one showed a teenage Michael Bennett helping a young boy with his homework at the community center. Bennett stared at the image, memories flooding back. I'd forgotten about this completely, he whispered. You spent every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon that summer tutoring that young man in mathematics, Dr. Richardson recalled. His name was Marcus Johnson. He's now a mathematics professor at Morehouse College. Chief Judge Williams watched this exchange with interest. It seems, Michael, that you have a history of service worth remembering, and perhaps worth returning to. Dr. Richardson leaned forward slightly. The community center still needs tutors, Your Honor. Perhaps, as part of this new program, you might consider returning to teaching mathematics. It could help remind other judges that we're all part of the same community. Judge Bennett looked at the photograph again, seeing in it the person he had once been, and perhaps could be again. The morning sun caught the tears in his eyes as he made his decision. Dr. Richardson, he said firmly, I would be honored to help in any way I can, but first, I believe I owe you one more apology. The elderly man raised his hand, stopping him with a gentle smile. What happened next would set in motion changes that would impact the Atlanta judicial system for years to come. 1 year later, the Atlanta Municipal Court looked quite different. The morning sun still streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 3A, but now photographs lined the walls, images of judges volunteering in community centers, working with youth programs, and engaging with the people they served. Judge Michael Bennett stood at the podium of the packed courtroom, but this time he wasn't presiding. Instead, he was addressing the newest class of judicial appointees at their swearing-in ceremony. Beside him sat Dr. Richardson, now 76, still carrying his wooden cane but looking as dignified as ever. 1 year ago, Bennett began, I learned the most important lesson of my career from this remarkable man beside me. He gestured toward Dr. Richardson. It wasn't just about respect or dignity, though those were crucial lessons. It was about the true meaning of justice. The audience listened intently. Among them sat Marcus Johnson, the boy from the old photograph, now a distinguished mathematics professor. Next to him was Sarah Martinez, recently appointed as the head of the State Bar Association's Community Outreach Program. Thanks to Dr. Richardson's guidance, Bennett continued, our judicial community engagement program has trained over 50 judges. We've established mandatory cultural sensitivity workshops, and every judge now spends at least 1 day a month working directly in community organizations. Dr. Richardson smiled quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd of eager young judges. The community center that had sparked this transformation was now thriving, its historic status secured. The Atlanta Development Corporation had not only withdrawn their lawsuit, but had also established a substantial endowment for the center's programs. But perhaps the most significant change, Bennett said, his voice growing warmer, is what happens in our courtrooms every day. We've seen a 40% increase in positive feedback from the public. Cases involving underprivileged defendants are being handled with greater understanding and compassion. He paused, looking at the photograph of his younger self tutoring Marcus Johnson, now prominently displayed on the courtroom wall. I've returned to tutoring mathematics at the community center every Tuesday and Thursday, just like I did as a teenager, and I'm proud to say that 12 other judges have joined me in various volunteer roles. Dr. Richardson slowly rose to his feet, ready to address the new judges. The room fell silent in respect. When I walked into this courtroom a year ago, he said, his voice still strong and clear, I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was simply fighting to preserve a place that had helped thousands of children find their path in life. But sometimes, the greatest lessons come from unexpected moments. He turned to face Judge Bennett, and sometimes, those who seem furthest from understanding can become our strongest allies in creating change. Bennett nodded humbly, remembering his transformation from an arrogant judge to a committed advocate for judicial reform. The changes hadn't always been easy, but they had been necessary and deeply rewarding. To the new judges before us today, Dr. Richardson continued, remember that every person who enters your courtroom has a story. They have dreams, struggles, and potential, just like those children at our community center. Your duty is not just to uphold the law, but to see the humanity in every case you hear. As he finished speaking, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Judge Bennett helped Dr. Richardson back to his seat, no longer feeling shame but profound gratitude for the lessons he had learned. The ceremony concluded with each new judge taking an oath, not just the traditional judicial oath, but a new additional pledge to serve their community with empathy, understanding, and respect. It had been Dr. Richardson's idea, now adopted by courts across the state. As the sun set on that meaningful day, Judge Bennett and Dr. Richardson stood together at the community center, watching a new generation of children getting help with their homework. The center's walls now displayed photographs of success stories, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and judges who had started their journeys in those very rooms. "You know, Dr. Richardson," Bennett said softly, "when you first walked into my courtroom that day, I thought I was the one sitting in judgment. I never imagined I was the one being taught." Dr. Richardson smiled, his wise eyes twinkling. "The best lessons, Judge Bennett, are the ones we don't even know we need to learn."